Hello and welcome to the Modern Homesteading Podcast. This is your host, Rachel Jameson. Today I am doing a solo podcast, kind of a in the kitchen podcast. So this episode is about grinding, soaking, and sprouting grains in your homestead kitchen. I thought I would talk about the reasons why and the differences between them. There's a lot of confusion about it, and it's actually a lot simpler than it sounds. Many people think that it is really difficult when actually it's just super simple and straightforward. It is a little bit more time consuming because you can't just stuff your grains into the grinder and make bread, but there's reasons why people do it. And I'm going to get into that in the podcast. So I have also backed this up with some research that I've found, which you're going to find if you go to the website and the podcast website. So there'll be links there if you want to follow those and do some of this research yourself and read it. That said, just grinding your own grain is, much healthier than buying flour. But either way, even if you're just starting from flour from the store, our podcast is always about doing what you can where you're at. And so if that's just where you're at, that's fine. But I'm going to talk about getting into doing this because a lot of people are getting into doing this. So anyway, I'm going to start with grinding grains. Basically, grinding grains is what it sounds like. You grind dry grains into flour. It's best to grind them fresh and use them or freeze them after you grind them because the flour retains freshness and it retains minerals better that way, which is why freshly grinding is ideal if you're going to be grinding your own grains. So you store the whole grains. I store mine in 5-gallon buckets. Well, I shouldn't say that. I store them in 2 to 5-gallon buckets, depending on what the grain is. There's some grains that I use a lot of and some that I don't. Now, remember, I am gluten-free due to my celiac disease, but you can do this with any grain. You can do this with wheat and oats and rye, which all have gluten in them. Oats are cross-contaminated, so I avoid them, but you get my point. You can do this with any grain. There's a numerous amount of grains. It wasn't until I became celiac that I started to understand how many grains there were. So there's numerous grains out there. There's some pseudo grains, buckwheat. It's technically not a grain. It's a pseudo grain. It's part of the rhubarb family. But there's all these different kind of grains that store best the way nature stores them, which is in their seed form. And they store best whole. They retain more of their nutrition that way. And once they're ground, you start to lose nutrition. So that is the premise behind why people like to buy whole grains and store them. You also, in many ways, can save money. But the grains that you can use to do this, to grind with, are wheat, rye, oats, sorghum, corn, popcorn, rice. Yes, you can grind popcorn. They're just numerous. My gluten-free go-to grains are millet, sorghum, rice, and teff. I'm trying to think if I have other ones. Those are the ones I grind a lot of, are those 3. Buckwheat also. Although it technically isn't a grain, but I grind those a lot to make a lot of my recipes and stuff like that. Now, I don't bake like I used to with my kids not home, so I don't use as many, but I do buy these. I buy my stuff in anywhere from 10 to 25 pound bags. Now, if I could find them in 50, I would, but gluten-free grains are a little bit harder to find whole. If you're buying wheat, there's so many varieties of wheat. A lot of people are really liking spelt and einkorn. I believe I said that right. Those you can easily buy in 50-pound bags. And a lot of the times it's cheaper to buy in larger quantities, and it's cheaper to buy whole sometimes, but not always. So anyways, one of the reasons so I'm going to go through, I have down here 7 reasons on why to grind your own grains. One of them is freshness. So you get fresh ground flour, which retains more of its nutritional value, and flavor. It's kind of like getting a store tomato versus your homegrown tomato. There is a flavor difference. The second one is nutritional value. Whole grains contain more vitamins. I already talked about that. Minerals and fiber. Grinding allows you to use the entire grain. Now, some people will sift out, the outer kernel. Why can I not think of the name of it? But maybe I will remember as I'm talking. But the chaff, and some people will grind and then sift things out. I don't. Although with gluten-free grains, there doesn't tend to be that issue as much. The other thing is, number 3 is you can customize your texture. So some people like a not so dense of a flour, or I guess a more coarse grind. I'm thinking of something like cornmeal. Some people like to get it way down and super, super fine, which works best when you're dealing with gluten-free, is to have it super fine, because you don't have that gluten to hold things together. It tends to be grainy if you don't do that. So you can customize your texture. 4, you can have variety. There's so many varieties and grains to choose from. Like I was just talking about, if you're not gluten-free, there's all of the wheat varieties. There's multiple kinds. And then the same thing even with gluten-free stuff. You can choose your variety, where sometimes it's really hard to find. Buckwheat flour is pretty easy to find. Millet flour can be kind of hard to find at the grocery store. Any of these whole grains can actually be kind of hard to find if they're gluten-free. But anyways, you get your variety. 5, storability. So whole grains, if stored properly, can store for a very long time. So you put them in a 5-gallon bucket, in a Mylar bag with some oxygen or moisture absorbers. You have the recipe for storing for a very long time. I mean, I think all of us know that they have found grains stored in vases in the Middle East that are centuries old. So stored properly, they can store for a long time. And I actually have a link that will be in the podcast notes talking about storing wheat. And I also have a link talking about nutritional characteristics of stone ground and conventional breads. So that's the other thing. So number 6 would be control over additives. So one of the things that happens when they grind flour is to either replace the bran or replace the fact that nutrition is lost when it's sitting around after it's ground, is they fortify it. And they'll fortify it with different vitamins and minerals. Certain people don't need excess iron because they have a medical condition where they actually get too much on their own. Or certain people like me cannot have folic acid because I have a genetic variant that I don't do well if I have folic acid. Well, they put that in a lot of flour. So you can avoid those things if you like. And then number 7, I already touched on this, was the economic value. So in some instances, this saves money. With gluten-free flour, it doesn't always save money, but sometimes it can. So it really just depends. But you can save money doing this. So I already mentioned the 2 links. Soaking. So soaking grains, this method is basically you soak the grain by you using clean water. So it's either filtered water or you're on a well and you know your water is good. So you're going to soak your whole grain, and the time depends upon the grain. And I'm putting a timeline guide in the notes for you to reference. So a smaller grain obviously will take longer than a larger grain. A harder grain will take more than a softer grain to soak. And the soaking process just helps get rid of anti-nutrients, which I'll talk about a little bit, but I'm not going to get overly into it because you could talk for hours on this subject. Some folks also use an alkaline substance for soaking grains, like whey, leftover from cheese making, or lemon. It's pretty normal for corn mesa, which was what they make tortillas out of, to be soaked in lime, or ash. Of course, I'm talking food grade lye, not, life or plumbing. The book Nourishing Traditions covers all sorts of things about soaking grains, and it covers it at length and has several recipes, tricks, and tips in there. So my list of reasons why to do this is 1, it increases the nutritional absorption. So soaking it helps with anti-nutrients. There's anti-nutrients in certain grains. I printed this page. This is on page 7 of 14, and this is a research article that I have linked in the website if you want to go to it. But I printed this page just to remember to tell you which ones. So, for example, soybean, the anti-nutrients in soybeans are tannins, phytates. They're also inhibitors for certain enzymes. Let me see. We'll do corn. Corn has phytates in it. Wheat has tannins and phytic acid. Rice has phytic acid. Millet has tannins. So you get all of these they have good qualities to them. They're not bad things. Tannins and phytates, they're there for a reason. But they do inhibit absorption. And if you already have gut issues, they're going to inhibit absorption. So all plants have some anti-nutrients in them that inhibit your absorption of them. And so soaking them actually helps your body it helps the grain pre-digest. It gets rid of some of those anti-nutrients so that your body can take up things like the B vitamins in them easier. So anyways, we talked about that. Number 2, it's improved digestibility. So they've actually done research and studies on all of these things. I'm not just going woo-woo on you. And I've linked to them. Number 3 is it reduces the cooking time, which is actually really nice, especially if so one of the things we don't do a lot of anymore, and we used to, is we don't cook whole grains. What we typically do now is we grind them and make them into products. But what used to happen a lot was people made a lot of porridges. So they would make barley soup, for example, with whole pieces of barley. They would make salads, but they did a lot of porridge where they wouldn't even process the grain. They would just soak it and then cook it. So it reduces the amount of cooking time. This works, I guess something that we do use a lot like this anymore is rice. So it would reduce the cooking time for rice, which can be helpful if you're in a hurry. But it's one of the bonuses. Number 4 is you get a better texture. Again, you get a better texture when you soak something. Think about beans, for example. A lot of people are used to pre-soaking dry beans. You get a better texture if you pre-soak them and then you cook them. The same thing can happen with grains. It's just we're not as used to doing grains this way anymore. And then 5 is reducing the phytic acid. And I guess that kind of goes with number 1, which was increasing nutrient absorption. So I have a couple of articles. I have linked to a couple of articles in here. I have linked to some how-tos from Nourished Kitchen and Nourishing Home. So that helps you get through the how-to process. So I'm just going to talk to you about it, and then you can go to the page and see these links to learn how to do it. A third thing is sprouting. So sprouting grains so you soak them, you go past the soaking. So basically what I do, for example, is I will soak something for 24 hours. Say it's rice. Now, obviously I talked about how there's different timetables in the previous topic of soaking. So you use that timetable, and then what you would do is you would rinse twice a day. Just like if you were sprouting sprouts, like radish sprouts to put on your salad. Same thing, same idea. So you're going to soak them, and then you're going to drain them, and you're going to rinse them a few times a day, and they're going to get a little tiny sprout on them. Now, you're not wanting them to get green or anything like that, but once they get a little tiny sprout on them, you can then cook them consume them as a grain, or you can dry them and grind them back into flour. Does this take a lot of time? Yes. And I don't know if I would say a lot of time. Once you get used to it, it's kind of like when you make kombucha or you make your coffee in the morning. It just kind of becomes part of your routine, and it really only takes you a couple of minutes to set it up and do it all the time. It really does become part of your routine. And once it does, it's really not a big deal. I just suggest you add things slowly and get used to it. And once you're used to it, you're used to it, and that's it. So why do this? Well, for the same reason as you would soak them, sprouting them does the same thing, but maybe a little bit more. I've linked an article here to Harvard Health that talks about sprouting grains and talks about if they're more nutritious than not sprouting them. So number one, it increases your nutrient absorption. It improves digestibility is number two. Number three, you get higher antioxidant levels, which is really important. Antioxidants help us be healthy. They help us fight all the bad things that are going on in the world as far as sun exposure and radiation and all that kind of stuff. Number four, they reduce anti-nutrients. And number five, again, they enhance flavor. And number six, they enhance texture. So personal experience here for me, one of the problems with cooking gluten-free is it uses a lot of rice. Now, I have learned to use a lot of other grains, but rice is still one of my main grains. It's the main grain that my gluten-free sourdough is made from. So I call him Mr. Bubbles. Mr. Bubbles. I actually have Mr. and Mrs. Bubbles now in case Mr. Bubbles goes bad. I have Mrs. Bubbles. But my sourdough starter is 100% brown rice. And even with me home grinding them in my own grinder, it still has a little bit of a grittier texture. Especially if I was just going to make bread, but not make sourdough. It just tends to be a little bit grittier. And that's just how rice is. And I am home grinding it on the lowest setting that I can possibly do. But I found that if I sprout the brown rice and then dry it and then grind it, I get a much softer, fluffier flour, which makes me have a fluffier product. Is it a lot of work? Yes. We don't tend to eat a lot of grains. So for me, it's worth it. Now, if you were eating bread every day, it might be something that you want to do in a large batch and then put in the freezer. That would probably work. You could hold it over for a little while. You can buy sprouted grains. I'm kind of on the fence. I haven't done the research, and maybe I should have for this podcast, but I would look into if you're going to do buying sprouted grains, how long ago it was sprouted and how much it sat around after it was sprouted and then dried. I would just look into that. So this is where you kind of get into, so both of these kind of started getting you into, so sprouting and soaking, started you getting into the methods of like fermenting the grains and sourdough. So we're going to talk a little bit about fermenting grains. You can ferment any grain whole, or you can make a flour and ferment it, hence sourdough. It can be made and done that way. There are some grains that do better with that. With gluten-free stuff, it seems like all of my research and making sourdough, gluten-free sourdough, it seems like the brown rice seems to be the one grain that almost always has good outcome. Now, people do use other grains, but brown rice seems to be the one that people have a good outcome with in making sourdough starter. You can always convert it after that, or you can always make the rest of the loaf something else. There are people out there doing other ones. I just have not. I would like to experiment with that, and I have not done that yet. I'm going to put a link in the podcast note to a YouTube channel called Fresh is Real. It's the YouTube channel where I started with when I started making gluten-free sourdough. This isn't going to help you if you're not gluten-free. If you're making other sourdough, of course, there are tons and tons of websites out there to research for making sourdough with gluten-containing grains. But when you're doing gluten-free sourdough and anything gluten-free, it's just kind of a different animal. It's a little bit harder to work with. There's nothing holding the dough together. So you can't just make your grain, salt, and water like you can if you have wheat. You need to do a mix of grains and starches. So usually it's typically like a potato starch or an arrowroot starch, along with your rice or your millet. And a lot of them will use psyllium husk. I'd like to see what would happen if I would use an egg, but I haven't gotten that far yet. So anyways, it's just a different animal. But sourdough is just, it's amazing. And it's kind of the perfect compilation of everything I was just talking about. Outside of, you don't have to grind your own grain to do sourdough. You don't have to sprout it to do sourdough, but sourdough is basically soaking. So you kind of get the benefits, even if you don't want to do all the other work. Now, the reason you do sourdough is you get improved digestibility, which I have a link for in here, talking about the differences in the digestibility. It is a study that they did. So again, it's a kind of a boring medical link, but people sometimes want that information. I know I always do. Number 2 is enhanced nutritional availability. Of course, I also put a link there for it. And then the talk about probiotic, which I found this really interesting. So in doing my research, I always thought that sourdough had probiotics. But now they're saying maybe it doesn't. Maybe it has prebiotics, which there is a difference. So there's a link to that study in there. It's called From the Real Food Dietitians. I put a link there for that study. But either way, it's really good for your belly. Number 4, better glycemic control. They do have some studies stating that it does lower the glycemic content of bread by making sourdough. Number 5, it extends the shelf life of your bread. Now, I don't know how long it extends the shelf life because it never lasts long enough around here for me to try. So who knows? Number 6, you get that unique flavor profile. Some people like it, some people don't, but you definitely get that soury taste. And you can change that soury taste. When your sourdough is working and in its little jar, sometimes some of the liquid will separate from the grain and the flour in there. And they call that the hooch because it smells alcohol-y, fermenty. You can dump that and it gets rid of some of that really sour taste. Now, some people love it and they stir it back in. Some people don't like it that sour. So there's ways to adjust it. I would really encourage you to get into groups or find somebody's page that's made it for a long time and they can talk more about those kind of things. But I have a bunch of different links here talking about all of these things. And then the very big link that I have for that 14-page document that talks about, I'm trying to find the name of the document. It's called Food Production, Processing, and Nutrition. So it's 14 pages and it goes at length into many, many things about not just about grains, but it also talks about beans as well, which beans do also have anti-nutrients and properties that can inhibit absorption. I'm trying to think if I have anything else to add to this. I'm going to add links. Well, I'm going to add links to this about the different books. I talked about Sally Fallon's book, which is Nourishing Traditions. But another book that is really, really good for people is Sander Kott's book, The Art of Fermentation. And he has many other books about fermenting. He talks at length about fermenting and he ferments everything. And if you're interested in fermenting grains and beans, he definitely is your guy. And if you like books and you like cookbooks, he's definitely your guy. And you'll see a lot of information there. There really isn't a limit to what you can do with this. And I wanted to encourage you guys to get into the kitchen and start doing some experimenting. Start learning to cook. I know some of you are probably fantastic cooks. And then there's people out there that are like me. When I got married, I didn't know how to cook and I didn't know how to do any of this. So I kind of had to learn on my own. And so I just wanted to encourage people to start looking into this stuff, start taking your food seriously. Not that you don't, but you get what I mean. And then with your grains, unfortunately, grains are really affordable if you compare them to other foods like meat and cheese and everything. And other whole foods, the most affordable whole foods are grains and legumes. And those are the ones with a lot of anti-nutrients. So learning to properly prepare them really helps. You get the most nutrition out of the money that you spent. And it also can help you save a lot of money. If you can get a lot of nutrition out of the grains and legumes, maybe you can save a little bit of money not buying some of the other things. Now, of course, you guys all know that I love my meat and my eggs, but I also understand we're all on a budget, and with the cost of groceries going up, it's going to become more important that we focus on the nutritional density of the food that we're preparing in our kitchens. I hope that this really, really helps some of you understand these processes with soaking, sprouting, grinding, and fermenting. It seems really confusing and overwhelming. I know I was overwhelmed at first and I couldn't wrap my brain around it, but it really is simple. So follow some of the links if you're interested. And I think you'll be surprised at just how simple it is. So start slow and work your way up. Maybe start with buying freshly ground flour and trying to make some sourdough at home, or just making cookies with freshly ground grain. I have a couple of friends that actually went together and purchased a grain grinder, and that's how they do it because they can be very expensive. But I also know there's also a couple of places here locally that have bread. We have actually a bread CSA here. So they buy some of their grain locally, and then the bakery makes the bread and it's all fresh ground. They also sell fresh ground flour if people just want to pick up bags of flour. So you never know. Start looking around. You might find something like that. I know a lot of the co-ops also sell sprouted flour. Our co-op here, which is a natural food store, our natural food co-op store here, has those sprouted grains and legumes, but they're refrigerated, which is ideal. So just look into that. Start taking some baby steps. I hope that this helps anyone. And again, if you have questions, feel free to shoot me an email or a question. Go to the website where the podcast is posted and look at all the links, and that might help you too. So I hope this helps. Grow where you're planted.